You unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of sound. A dimension of sight. A dimension of mind. The Twilight Zone is a masterclass of pop culture and horror fiction, a landmark title in a genre it helped to pioneer. The Twilight Zone is a precious piece of media history, but despite countless attempts to revive it, the series reboots have never seen the same kind of universal fan acclaim that the original series enjoyed. But why is that? What about the reboots went wrong during the creation process? And what, if anything, did the reboots actually do right? Today's episode of Octo's Corner is somewhat unique, and calls for a different kind of introduction. Tonight, dear viewers, a retrospective and review. A long overdue analysis into the history of the Twilight Zone, and what has become of its legacy in the modern era. I'm Octo, and this is a deep dive. Welcome aboard. It may interest you to know that the Twilight Zone has had many reboots over the years. While the majority of the fanbase can agree that these reboots aren't of the same level of quality as the original series was, trying to define where these reboots go wrong is where the disagreements arise. Some say that the reboots are too political, while others argue that they aren't political enough. Some say the horror aspect of the show is dialed up too much, while still others maintain that the new series just aren't as scary as the old ones. The truth of the matter is that what made the Twilight Zone work in the first place cannot be boiled down to one specific concept or idea. There is no cheat code or easy recipe to developing a good episode. You just know one when you see one. Kinda like a fine cuisine or 5-star meal. The recipe is never as simple as just add water with something like this. But while anyone can tell the difference between high-class food and your average Big Mac, very few people can accurately recite the exact steps that it takes to cook them properly. And those who do tend to prefer to create their own masterpieces, rather than attempt to recreate another chef's signature dish. The goal of today's video is to take a dive into another dimension, to uncover the secrets behind the success of the original Twilight Zone, and discuss what problems kept the multitude of reboots, especially the latest attempt by filmmaker and actor Jordan Peele, from reaching the same level of success that Rod Serling enjoyed in the 60s. However, in order to do that properly, we first have to discuss the reboots on their own terms. What are they, and what is the context behind them? Let's begin.
What you're about to see, gentlemen, is a series called The Twilight Zone. We think it's a rather special kind of series. Essentially, people watch television to get entertained. And the keynote of this series, the thing we're concerned with, the thing we're aiming for, the thing we're working toward, is entertainment.
The original Twilight Zone aired its first official episode on October 2nd, 1959. But the concept itself came much earlier than that. Rod Serling, the show's host, had already become a big name in American television through his other works, but was often dissatisfied with the way production companies tended to strike certain words or phrases from his scripts. It was apparently not at all uncommon for sponsors of Rod's programs to remove anything that may remind viewers of a competitor, with the most notable example being the time when Ford Motor Company called for the removal of the Chrysler Building from a shot of the New York City skyline. It seems that what Rod Serling truly wanted was a canvas, through which to tell stories that were more controversial than was often seen on TV at the time, with messages that were to shock and stick with its viewers long after the program ended. While he was occasionally given a platform to do this, Serling was still marred by censorship and forced to show restraint in his work, something that understandably left him with a fair amount of frustration. Finally, in 1957, Rod Serling wrote a script for what was to be a pilot for The Twilight Zone. The story was called The Time Element and featured the unfortunate case of a man finding himself back in the year 1941 and attempting to warn everyone about the impending attack on Pearl Harbor.
December 6th.
The script contains many of the same elements as all the best episodes of The Twilight Zone, and I highly recommend watching The Time Element if you haven't before. While originally shelved, the pilot was eventually able to be used as a segment on the anthology program Desilu Playhouse in 1958. The segment was a huge success, allowing Rod Serling to create the anthology series he had always wanted to make. This is where the all-time classic that remains a part of pop culture to this day was born. Twilight Zone continued to run for 5 seasons, from 1959 all the way to June of 1964, when A World of His Own became the swan song for an all-time great, and an icon of the mysterious and terrifying. While not every episode is perfect, the vast majority are landmark experiences that any horror or sci-fi fan should be required by law to experience at least once. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, it's that good. We'll be getting into the specifics of this series quite a bit as this video goes on, so for now let's turn to the black sheep of the family. That is, most of the rest of the franchise. In 1985, the television world was treated to a revival that, on the surface, looked as though it would become a new but worthy member in the Twilight Zone family. Again, what it did right and what it did wrong will be discussed later on, but it is worth noting that the series has the honor of lasting the longest of all the reboots at the time of me writing this, though I suspect that Jordan Peele's revival may live to take that title for itself in a few years' time. The opening theme was performed by the Grateful Dead, and is probably the best thing to come out of the series if I'm being honest. This series reveled in separating itself from its predecessor, and was as much of a parody of the original as it was a rebirth, intentionally or otherwise. Even the logo design is drastically different from anything else in the franchise. I wouldn't be opposed to seeing this logo returned to for a special or future reboot. This unique approach to the Twilight Zone would prove to be inspirational in its own right, with shows like Are You Afraid of the Dark taking near lawsuit levels of inspiration from it. The series ran for 3 seasons and contained 65 episodes, from 1985 to 1989. There's also a lot wrong with the 80s series, but again, we'll discuss this series further later on. In 2002, the series came back yet again, this time with Forrest Whitaker taking control of the very early 2000s rendition of the show, and went on to become the shortest-lived reboot out of all of them, lasting only 1 season, which consisted of 43 episodes, which also makes it a very long season of television. Actually, finding a copy of the 2002 series is quite difficult, so if you happen to own one and want to get rid of it, make sure you sell it instead of trash it. Only a finite amount of copies exist, so it's important that it be preserved in some way or another. The series logo went for a mixture of the 80s series and the original, which didn't really produce the kind of result that I can honestly say deserves praise, because it looks closer to like what you'd see as the logo for a fun center than the logo for a sci-fi horror anthology made for adults. But such is to be expected for the time period, and that's all I really have to say about this series for now. Though rest assured, we will be discussing it later on, so if you're one of this show's small but dedicated fanbase, there's still something for you to look forward to. Finally, in 2019, the reboot that the Twilight Zone was fabled to get all throughout the 2010s finally came about, and not as the VR spin-off series that some news outlets were claiming it would be. Instead, Jordan Peele of Get Out fame was to be handling the series, and I for one became quite excited at the prospect of Peele directing the series. Get Out felt to me like a long episode of The Twilight Zone anyway, so I was excited to see where he would take the series, especially given his love for social commentary in his work. The logo returned to the original one we all know and love, which seemed to imply a return to form, something the franchise desperately needed, and something that the general public was finally ready for after the resurgence of interest in the Twilight Zone that the wonderful theme park attraction had created years prior, and recently with its unfortunate closure at the hands of Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy. Side note, if anyone at Disney is listening right now, I absolutely forbid you from removing the Disney World variant in Florida. I will even put up with you making a mockery of the show and its legacy by covering it with toys for the holiday season, just as long as the ride stays put. It's the best themed attraction in the entire world, and I will not allow you to remove it. Oh, I'm sorry, I lost my cool for a bit there. Anyway, where was I? Oh, yes. While the first season of the 2019 reboot was an absolute embarrassment to Rod Serling's original, and an offensive blanket of shame and disrespect to what made the original so iconic, the second season was a great step in the right direction. Though, to be honest, it's also terrible. To be clear though, I feel confident at this time that future seasons will only continue to improve, and hopefully, in so doing, CBS All Access will become worth the asking price in some way.
You want to find out?
Aside from the movie, which I will not be talking about in this video because I feel it deserves its own video essay, that essentially sums up the television history of The Twilight Zone. Now that you understand the history of the series, it's time to discuss why every reboot of Rod Serling's classic series seems doomed to failure. Let's begin. So for the next little bit, we're basically going to go through a checklist of sorts. First things first, we'll go through every fundamental thing about the Twilight Zone that the reboots fail at, which means this is going to be very long. So check the timestamps in the description to make your way to a specific section if you decide to come back and finish watching later. Arguably the most iconic thing about The Twilight Zone is its opening monologue, which is why it's imperative that anyone trying to recapture the essence of the series would need to make sure that their host and monologue bits are taken care of. Many of you will likely ride what I'm about to say off as nitpicking, but I promise it's important. In the original series, each episode begins with an introduction monologue, but each does it right at the beginning. No cold open, just right into the Twilight Zone. And that's just the point of placing it where it is. From the moment you see this sign, you're in the Twilight Zone, and everything you see from here on out is up to your interpretation. From here on out, you're on a tour of a specific place, time, or event. Rod Serling is our guide, but even he won't tell you everything, and it's up to you to pay close attention because once that intro plays, anything could happen. Once that intro plays, you're in the Twilight Zone. Just to confirm this sentiment, our host always greets us by reminding us that we've made the journey, and that we're in a land bound only by imagination. The order is intro, then monologue, and if you're going to screw it up, you may as well not have an intro at all. When you're entering a home, the door opens, then the host welcomes you in, and then when you leave, he or she says goodbye. You'd think it would be kind of awkward if the person welcomes you to their home, and then you get in the car and drive to their house, and then open the door after the fact. The Twilight Zone is all about immersion, because you need to be all in if you're going to have any hope of uncovering the mystery which is unraveling around you every episode. Yet for some reason, the Reboot series feels this need to put the intro after the monologue. Commercial breaks are one thing, but interrupting your own story like this just makes the whole thing feel repetitive. At the end of one monologue, you find yourself with another one, and most of the time the intro sequence isn't actually very good either, which means it's about time to compare intro sequences. The original series has multiple intro sequences, each direct and to the point, but one in particular out of the bunch is the best one, and I'm of the opinion that the best intro sequence from the series is the one that's used in Season 4, which I realize is somewhat ironic considering the overall quality of Season 4, but I think this intro perfectly captures everything the Twilight Zone is, and some of what you can expect to see once inside. For further proof, look to the Twilight Zone Tower of Terror. As previously mentioned, it's the greatest theme park ride ever built. The intro sequence used in the opening segment of the ride is none other than the iconic Season 4 intro, which honestly might be the reason it became iconic in the first place. The Tower of Terror brought a multitude of new fans to the franchise, and an acute appreciation for what the Twilight Zone is and what it did for filmmaking spread further as a result. If it hadn't been for the Tower of Terror, I don't know if I ever would have wanted to look deeper into the show's history and actually watch the series for myself, and I'm certain there's at least a few other people out there who can say the same thing. With this intro sequence being so important for so many people, and representing so much of what continues to welcome so many into the Twilight Zone, it seems only fair for it to therefore represent the original as the most iconic, though I do consider every other intro from this era to be of similar caliber. Before we move on to talking about how the reboots fail in this regard, let's rewatch this intro so we can compare it to the others moving forward. Pay close attention to the sound and atmosphere of this if you would. It's important for later.
You unlock this door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension. A dimension of sound. A dimension of sight. A dimension of mind. You're moving into a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas. You've just crossed over into the Twilight Zone.
Notice the use of quiet and subtle noises here, the way each subject fades in and out of existence, and how we pass through the door. Like I said earlier, all of this is in service of the show's immersion. We're being welcomed into the Twilight Zone, and whatever happens next will be contained by that one simple point of knowledge. The only thing we can be certain of from here on out is uncertainty, which, again, this is why placing it at the forefront of each episode is important. I genuinely have no idea why the reboots fail to understand this. Speaking of the reboots, let's look at the 80s series first. There's actually a lot to like here. As I said earlier, the 80s series is the most adaptive of the franchise. It gets away with putting the intro wherever it wants because the whole point is that it does its own thing. There's no host at first, at least not a physical one, leaving a reliance on atmospheric sounds and images to create the feeling of being transported into the Twilight Zone. It's quite a refreshing take, and like I said, the intro is probably the best part of this show. The ghostly image of Rod Serling at the end is a fantastic touch, and the guitar riff here gives me chills every time. It's precisely because of how different this series chose to be that it gets a pass on so many things that the other reboots get marked down for. Does that make the series good? Well, no. The 80s series, unfortunately, is probably the weakest of them all. But it almost manages to get away with it, because it's clear from the get-go that what you're watching is only inspired by the original, with moments here or there that call back to it, but by and large, this is not Rod Serling's The Twilight Zone. It's, George R.R. Martin's, apparently. Okay then. My point is that by making it so different from its predecessors, you've also made it more accessible and allowed for it to be met on its own terms, and honestly, I respect that about it. Inconsistencies and all. Then there's the 2002 series. Same issue with the intro being out of order, but this time much worse because, well, listen to it.
You're traveling to another dimension. A dimension not only of sight and sound, but mind.
That nasty, edgy sounding electric guitar that sounds like it hasn't been tuned in years, the monologue which is so quiet and whispery that you can barely make it out over all the noise, the capital X extreme vibe from the late 90s and early 2000s. This is a rough intro, especially when compared to the original. I actually do kind of like some aspects of the intro though. I think it's cool how we're traveling through this museum of Twilight Zone history alongside our host. It really harkens back to the guide taking us on a tour scenario from the original. This series also has a lot of good to talk about outside of the intro, because even though the first few episodes are terrible, there's also some real winners in here, like The Babysitter, starring Jessica Simpson. I also like this little outro melody they have at the end here.
Nice touch.
Moving on to the final reboot as of now, Jordan Peele's The Twilight Zone of 2019 and 2020. Now this is what I call an intro to The Twilight Zone. For as much as I dislike the actual series, I think we can all agree that this is one of the aspects of the show which Mr. Peele got absolutely right. The music, the visuals, it's fantastic. At least it would be, if it weren't for one tiny little issue with the writing. The monologue goes through the most iconic lines from the original, almost to a fault. My issue here is that while the visuals do bring something new to the table, the monologue feels repetitive because of this line in particular.
You are now traveling through a dimension of imagination.
So you've already said something very similar to this kind of thing earlier in the intro, and the line before this one was very climactic. It felt like the intro was over, and then started up again out of nowhere. It's that issue with the order of things again, but here it's a much bigger problem, because despite how small of an issue it may seem to be, it gets grating after a while, because it makes the intro feel longer than it really is, and it's such a simple fix that it makes me wonder why it remains in Season 2. My only thought is that nobody noticed the redundancy of this line, which I find horrifying. Because if they let this kind of mistake go unnoticed, what else are they going to leave in? I realize this is more so a nitpick than any of the actual issues from the other intros, but I still get taken out of the experience every time it happens, so as much as I'd like to sweep it under the rug, I have to point it out, because without it, the intro would be perfect. Everything else about this intro was so good, and I'd rather have a slightly repetitive intro than an extremely 2000s one. So of all the reboots, I do feel inclined to say that the 2019 series does the best job at capturing the original in a way that still allows for new and creative ideas. So good job, guys. Job well done. It's just a shame there isn't much else that's good about you. The only series that really messes up the color palette is the 2019 one, but that doesn't mean that the other reboots aged well either. Jordan Peele's color palette is definitely reminiscent of the original, in terms of values and set design. I understand that the goal was to use this palette and these costumes to recreate that sort of late 50s, early 60s clothing style that would harken back to the original series, and I like that, in concept. But at the same time, this sort of bizarre color correction only seems to dull the set pieces and colors, which ends up making the whole series feel boring. How do you distinguish a shot from The Twilight Zone from any other modern television program? I realize that this is an issue with TV in general, not just The Twilight Zone, but I don't typically watch other TV programs, I tend to prefer movies instead. No, it isn't fair to compare a series to a movie, but CBS, part of the reason you aren't getting the ratings you want is because of how bland your show looks. I'd recommend a less brown and gray color palette if you really want to stand out, even though I can appreciate what the set and costume designers were thinking when they made this decision. The original Twilight Zone was extremely well written. I'm not the first person to be saying that, and I know for sure that I won't be the last. Rod Serling was an excellent character writer, and trying in any way to follow in the footsteps of such a master of his class was never going to be an easy job to do. Every reboot struggles with this task at first. I've never seen a good first episode of any of the reboots, just to bring this point home. Let's take a look at the first episode of each reboot for proof. The 80s series begins with Shatter Day. By the way, naming your horror anthology episodes with puns is fine for series like Goosebumps or Are You Afraid of the Dark, maybe even for Tales from the Crypt. But if you want to be taken seriously, I would recommend avoiding names that are puns. I'd also avoid calling the episode about a contagious plague which blinds people many, many monkeys. But hey, I'm not a pro writer, so I have no say in the matter. The writing and acting in Shatter Day are awful.
There is nothing wrong with my life. Not one thing, nothing.
The 2002 series begins with this bizarre Electro from Spider-Man story, and 2019 has a good premise and likable characters. Huh, interesting. I wonder how this episode will go. Answer: it won't go anywhere. The main issue with the writing in 2019 series is that it's just plain old boring. It takes far too long and the dialogue isn't very good, even if the acting is surprisingly passable here. Side note, Peele's series is where the show became incredibly comfortable with cursing, and I usually don't have an issue with things like that, but I would like to remind all of you that cursing is not a substitute for good writing or engaging dialogue. Cursing is a lazy excuse to write things the easy way, and everyone on this project gets paid to write dialogue and episode scripts, so I know that they can write better dialogue than this. Most of these series actually seem to get the hang of this writing style over time, and manage to pump out really good episodes toward the end. Some of them I'd even put on the same level as Rod Serling's original, as surprising as that may sound. The 2019 series even had one good episode, but most of the time I find that this is the series where the writing disappoints me the most. With Jordan Peele taking the lead on both producing and hosting the new series, I suppose I had unreasonably high hopes from the start. Get Out felt to me like an extended and modern episode of The Twilight Zone, and while I was disappointed with the marketing of the film, I think that the writing was surprisingly tense. Especially given that Peele came from working on Key and Peele, where the writing is, let's call it subjective. It was precisely because of this level of Twilight Zone vibes that Get Out gave off that I was so excited to see how Jordan would handle the series, and I figured that given Mr. Peele's love for the not-so-subtle social commentary, which even mass audiences can clearly understand, I was convinced that there wasn't a man alive who was more suited to helming the remake. I still firmly believe that, though I do believe the success of Jordan Peele's second Twilight Zone-esque movie, Us, may have given him a bit of an undeserved ego boost. Sorry, Us fans, but the script is kind of weak. I like the concept, not so much the execution, and to be honest, I can say that about the majority of the new Twilight Zone series. The writing team had great ideas, they just felt clustered and boring at the same time because of the ridiculous need to fill a time slot. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself again. For a good example of what I mean when I say the writing isn't very good, let's compare some actual lines of dialogue.
I'll get it on the way out. Thank you.
We're gonna go home.
Okay. And then it'll just be a great story for Gretchen and Stacy.
Humans. Earth. We're on the brink.
But you can trust me. Look, can I play something for you on your TV?
You may notice that all of these characters talk in more or less the same way. You could argue that this is just how people today talk, and that's a fair point, but The Twilight Zone is an anthology. That means each episode should be a completely different story from the one that came before it. In the original, and even in the 80s and 2002 series, each character sounded different most of the time. Each story was about someone unique, and that made them interesting and exciting to watch. With these new episodes, though, none of these people seem to really act any different from one another. They're all the most average, basic, cardboard cutout individuals you've ever seen. And the thing is, this wouldn't actually be so bad all on its own, but when the mysteries and plot twists revolve around these characters, and they act like bricks most of the time, it really makes it hard for me to take anything that happens seriously. So many times we just get the slightly stressed, edgy person or the overconfident, successful person, and it's just really boring to have to sit through. And as a mystery thriller series, boring is the worst thing you can be. In fact, boring is the one thing you can't afford to be. And before you say it's only boring to me because I don't get it or something, let me counter by saying it's boring because I get it. In fact, most of the time, these writers seem to be so proud of their concepts and so afraid that those will be lost on the audiences that they feel some sort of carnal need to constantly feed us jumbled clumps of exposition, sometimes being so obvious and silly with it that you can compare many of the modern episodes of The Twilight Zone with programs that air on PBS Kids, and you'd be hard-pressed to find much of a difference outside of the use of profanity.
Well, I feel worried and nervous that we may not ever get the word.
So you feel anxious too?
Yes!
We are afraid of them waking up.
Because they have their own mind.
Their own terrible desires and wishes.
Simply put, the series never lets me sit and think. I never have any questions because every time something interesting does happen, there's always an explanation within 5 minutes. It's honestly infuriating to be treated like such a mindless viewer of television, especially in a series whose plot lines are as bland and uninteresting as Jordan Peele's Reboot. I can really tell that this show was written by somebody who used to work in comedy too, because more often than not, I find that the 2019 series feels like a parody of itself. A measly budget performance of a once great act that is lucky to be acting at the local comedy club every Wednesday night. It feels like a massive joke, and each and every person over there at CBS who is responsible for letting a series like this fester and rot into the clumsy, lifeless mess it is should be ashamed of themselves. But that's enough of me whining about the appalling writing from the distance. Let's get up close and personal with some specific examples from the show. For some reason, a lot of these new episodes seem really concerned about making sure that the viewer always has a clear understanding of exactly what's going on at all times, to the point where we have almost constant exposition happening. I think the reasoning behind that is that most of these episodes have adopted a sort of double twist approach to writing. You always begin with the first twist, for example, being telepathically connected to someone else's thoughts, realizing that the world has shut down around you, or straight up switching bodies with someone else when you make eye contact with them. Each of these are good concepts, and really fit the theme of The Twilight Zone on their own. They aren't bad ideas, and usually they are communicated quite well. Then, we get a crap ton of exposition, telling us exactly what the writers have envisioned the answers to those questions being. At one point, we get a full-on infomercial about the world we're in because the writers think that if we don't understand every tiny detail of how the first twist works, we'll all be too busy trying to figure it out to be able to appreciate the second twist. In each of the 3 examples I gave earlier, there's also a second twist that comes at the end, and only one of those 3 actually gets pulled off well. I was going to talk about each of these in detail, but this video is already long enough as it is, so we'll only really go in depth with the biggest offender. In the world's shut down scenario, our main character struggles with a sort of Matrix realization, but turned up a notch because who she actually is and the person whose life she's living through in the game are different. She doesn't remember being anyone else outside of this Matrix world, and at first people from the outside are trying to get her to log out because if server downtime lasts for too long and she remains logged in, she'll end up trapped in the game forever and be unable to log out, or something to that effect. So the first half is this whole identity crisis thing, and then our main character runs around hiding from the people who are apparently system admins, but for some reason are unable to track the locations of their players inside of a virtual map that they moderate over. So instead, we get this pointless bird thing that makes whale noises when it finds her, because the bird can actually track the players. So that plotline ends when another admin dressed as a janitor basically comes around and says, "Hey, I know you don't want to log out, so go ahead and sign this waiver here, and then you won't have to log out." And of course, even though that's what she wanted the whole episode, now that she can actually have it, she's like,
"But I think I can feel it."
Anyway, I could talk about this forever, but what I'm trying to say is that all of these stories have an uncanny need to introduce a bunch of pointless plot points, which only really serve as filler to the main plot, so that the episode can be as close to an hour as possible, and they really don't work very well. Speaking of which, the original run of The Twilight Zone had one season that everyone could agree was a tad below the level of quality of the rest. Pretty much everyone that I've ever spoken to who is familiar with the original series was pretty open about Season 4 being the worst one. It's also interesting to note that the majority of fans are quick to point out that the biggest issue with the season is its runtime. Season 4 of the original series was extended to an hour-long time slot, and expecting a sci-fi anthology series to come up with hour-long storylines each week when the team was used to producing only 20-minute stories is not the smartest corporate decision I've ever heard, but what do I know? The main issue with these episodes boils down mostly to the length adjustment, with many of Season 4's episodes feeling overly long and often dragged out. Simply put, these storylines just can't support an hour-long time frame under the budget they had, and any attempts to resolve that issue only seem to result in overcomplication. What I assume fans immediately knew then, and what I'm absolutely certain fans know now, is that The Twilight Zone was never meant to be broadcast as an hour-long segment. There are multiple reasons why this is, but the simplest way I can think to express this is that the type of story that is most prevalent in The Twilight Zone is short form. The mysterious events that occur within them are often simple concepts, which therefore only really need 20 or so minutes to accomplish whatever it is that they had set out to do. The subtext is what often ends up being the subject of extensive viewer afterthought, but even then, the subject matter is surprisingly easy to understand. In modern times, the subject matter of each episode is often divisive among the fanbase, just as much as the runtime is, but we'll get to that in a bit. In realization of their error, The Twilight Zone reverted back to its usual time set for its 5th and final season, which, although still somewhat divisive among fans when it comes to certain episodes, is widely seen as superior to the hour-long specials that comprised Season 4. For some reason, even though the Twilight Zone atmosphere is best achieved in shorter episodic bursts, the powers that be still seem pretty insistent on the whole hour-long installments idea. For the 80s series, though the show was initially given an hour-long time slot, this was used to air multiple short stories per episode, which led to stories of varying lengths and resulted in varying degrees of success. The main issue with the 80s series when it came to time was that despite being told that they were scheduled for a 10 o'clock p.m. spot on the air, the show ended up airing at 8 p.m. instead, something that nobody on the writing team was really very prepared for. With the first 6 episodes airing content that was definitely not appropriate to air what is referred to as family viewing time, the time slot, rather than the length of the episode, could very well have been one of the biggest strikes against the 80s series. In one of the episode commentaries on the DVD set, executive producer Philip DeJure cites this as what he believes is the main reason the ratings for The Twilight Zone dropped early on and never recovered. The idea of doing multiple stories per episode, though, is actually not bad. In fact, on paper it sounds fantastic. In 2002, the episodes were also an hour long each, but these episodes were split into 2 half-hour stories, which is honestly probably my favorite format for the series aside from the original. The real problem child of the franchise when it comes to the runtime is the 2019 series. Each episode is a different length, but all of them are entirely too long to be able to pull off a proper Twilight Zone story, and I'm not alone in thinking this either. Remember before when we talked about how the 2019 series employs this sort of double twist technique to each of its episodes? Well, this would be the reason why. In an effort to fill time, each story has become overcomplicated, so that it can keep the audience guessing, or at least that's what I'd imagine the reasoning behind the decision is. All it really does is overcomplicate the plot, and in many cases, these double twists end up leaving massive plot holes that distract heavily from the experience of watching. The only time this method actually worked for me was in Season 2, Episode 1, which, in my opinion, was one of the best to come out of the new series, but even that episode definitely has more than its fair share of issues, mostly with directing and atmosphere. The odd thing to me about this issue is that the runtime doesn't look like it has to be as long as it is to begin with. Episodes now vary in length to a surprising degree, and none of them ever feel like they needed to be as long as they are. They only ever use the extra time to drag out pre-existing simple stories to the point where they are no longer interesting. That, or they introduce side plots every so often just so that the characters can have something to do while the writers desperately try to fill the time slot they've been allotted. This is especially infuriating when the stories themselves have a decent amount of potential to them, which is often the case, and which is ultimately what I dislike most about the 2019 series. This kind of lazy, uninspired writing, designed purely to take up time, is a massive disappointment. And even though the other reboots also have problems, some of which we've yet to get into, I find myself constantly under the impression that the Twilight Zone 2019 couldn't even be bothered to try. The biggest takeaway from this segment is that more than anything, Jordan Peele's Twilight Zone seems to revel in wasting its audience's time, with bad dialogue and bland storylines. And nothing makes me more upset than when I realize that a series is perfectly content with wasting my time. So, in an effort to not waste any more of yours, let's just move off from this topic. There is a very specific feeling of mystery that comes with an episode of The Twilight Zone. And even if you aren't the biggest fan of the series, you likely know what I mean by that. Many pieces of modern entertainment have used this kind of atmosphere as an influence, the foundation of which led them to build incredible experiences that in some cases even managed to rise above the original series itself. But how does one define that atmosphere exactly? As much as I'd love to say what I said in the beginning, you know it when you see it, and just move on, I can't bring myself to do that. So instead, let's go over the recipe to a good episode of The Twilight Zone, in an effort to uncover the secret behind the proper atmosphere in the series, or its potential reboots. A user on the Twilight Zone subreddit commented a while back that the single constant that draws the series together is a sense of loss. And I agree with that sentiment, but I also think that defining it as just that is kind of underselling the broad appeal of the series. Yes, there is loss in each episode, but I think the most important aspect of any episode of The Twilight Zone is actually what it says about human nature. More so than that even, I believe The Twilight Zone is, at its core, a mix of three important themes: loss, human nature, and finally, the unexplainable or mysterious occurrence. Mixing these ingredients together fluidly is the ultimate key to any good episode of The Twilight Zone. For example, I've heard people complain about the new series being too political, or for delving into sensitive topics too frequently, relying on racism and immigration to sell itself to the masses, and in doing so, being rather flawed. That's true. But it isn't true for the reason people think it is. Yes, the original series also covered topics that could be considered political, but chose to take a non-biased approach to these topics, favoring whichever choice led to the survival and well-being of humankind as the right decision or course of action. In addition, these topics were discussed in ways that were unlikely to become dated quickly, or be immediately recognizable. It was able to do this because of the aforementioned mixture of the three ingredients. Let's look at some quick examples to identify this formula in the context of the original series. Specifically, let's look at three of my personal favorite episodes: Time Enough at Last, The Fever, and To Serve Man. In Time Enough at Last, the comment on human nature is that humans are naturally somewhat lazy, opting to long for free time and relaxation and choosing to put our effort into what makes us happy, rather than what our obligations tell us we should put first in life a surprising amount of the time. This is reflected by the love Burgess Meredith has for reading books, and is critiqued by the supporting cast. His wife, as well as his boss, constantly get on his case for his desire to read and the time he devotes to it. As the audience, we understand two things because of this setup and the way it's executed. First, we know that Meredith is probably in the wrong, because he seems to care more about books than his own well-being, or the well-being of his supposed loved ones. But we also know that reading in and of itself is not a bad thing, so the characters who get on Meredith's case about reading all the time are also partially in the wrong because of their ignorance to the importance of his hobby. The comment on human nature, which we explore for the majority of the episode, culminates with the unexplainable occurrence, the catastrophic event that somehow wipes all life from the area, while Burgess Meredith reads in the basement. Now, Meredith has time to read all he wants, so his one great desire has been granted. However, because we know that Meredith was also in the wrong, or at least not entirely in the right, we still expect him to learn a difficult lesson from it all. That means that even if some of us are happy for our main character, we're still expecting something else to happen, because Meredith still doesn't understand his mistake. Finally, in comes the final element: loss. Meredith loses his glasses, the tool he would have used to read the mountain of books he longed for, and robbing him of what he truly wanted. Now Meredith has all the time in the world, which was exactly what he had thought he wanted, but the ultimate question comes when we, along with Mr. Serling, reflect on the true tragedy of the situation. Meredith has nothing but his joy of reading, which means that when that ultimately temporary pleasure has been taken from him, he is left with nothing. Nothing, that is, except for time. You see, what Meredith was missing was never time to begin with. It was balance. His life was not well-rounded, and all of his wants and efforts were placed squarely on his one hobby, which he now is unable to indulge in. As you can see, all three elements of the recipe work together to tell an excellent story with the kind of atmosphere that the Twilight Zone became known for. Notice the emphasis on faulty decisions as well, and how the end result is ultimately punishing to the self-entitled, or rewarding to the meek and humble. Let's look at example number 2. In The Fever, the human nature side of the episode is revealed immediately. Addiction is an aspect of human nature that we're all aware of, and one that is scary enough on its own to warrant being the sole purpose of the episode. We know from the get-go also that the fault lies with Mr. Gibbs, because rather than allowing himself to relax and enjoy the vacation, he instead touts a holier-than-thou attitude, scoffing at the others in the casino, while simultaneously touting himself as a man of superior intellect, who knows better than to simply throw his money away. Also on display here are statements about greed and of desperation. When a drunk man gives Franklin Gibbs the coin and convinces him to put it in the machine, Franklin wins the jackpot, which is what you could consider to be the unexplainable occurrence in this episode. Despite trying over and over to convince himself and his wife that he is better somehow than his fellow men, Franklin ultimately becomes helplessly addicted to the slot machine, and it is in his addiction that he loses his winnings, his money, his dignity, and eventually his life, at the hands of a sickness he claimed to be immune to. Once again, a tragic and ironic end befalls the man who scoffed at what he knew was dangerous. Anyone who knows someone who is dangerously addicted to gambling will find this story especially terrifying. In our final example, which I picked purely because it depends more on the supernatural element than the other two so that I could showcase this principle applied to a varied sample, we'll be talking about the fan favorite To Serve Man. The commentary on human nature is that humans overcomplicate things. While at first that may seem jarringly incorrect to you, hear me out. The aliens give mankind no reason to believe that they are in any real danger from the start, yet both as an audience and through the eyes of the main character, we must remain cautious because these things are new and look different from us. No matter how good the stakes get, it's only when it becomes overwhelmingly convenient for us that we let our guard down. By the way, the unexplainable occurrence should be obvious here, but just so you know I've pointed it out, it's the arrival of the alien species. The loss in this episode depends greatly on how you look at it, as there are multiple different things that are lost. But our sense of caution seems to be the most important one, with the ultimate message being that if something seems too good to be true, then it probably is. This is how the feel of a Twilight Zone episode, its atmosphere, if you will, is created. Since we'll be talking later on about how this is done correctly in the reboots, I'm instead going to focus on cases in which they fail miserably. I won't go into a whole lot of extra detail on this here, because I feel I've already said enough to make my point on the matter, but the examples are worth pointing out, if for no other reason than to showcase how bad things can get when you ignore this rule. In the 80s series, you have this micro-story called Grandma. It's the perfect example of doing almost everything incorrectly. The story goes that this child named Georgie...
Hiya, Georgie.
Yeah, real creative name for your victim, kid, guys. Is left alone with his senile... Wow. Anyway, Georgie is left alone with his senile grandma, who makes demonic noises and turns into a demon while Georgie enters and exits her room over and over, each time coming up with a somehow more idiotic excuse as to why he needs to return to the room.
Yeah, but now wait a minute! Catch hold of this! What if that's some kind of secret place Grandma's got in there, full of secret stuff?
Then Grandma dies, and George merges with her, becoming a demon creature, just like Grandma always was. I'm not making this up. That's the entire plot, and if you don't believe me, look this episode up on Wikipedia or watch it yourself like I did. Honestly, this feels like more of a Goosebumps or Are You Afraid of the Dark segment than a Twilight Zone episode. It has 2 or 3 of the ingredients, with the many, many unexplainable occurrences and the loss of a grandma, but actually undermines both of them by explaining the paranormal stuff in a way that ultimately leaves no further questions to be asked, and also by implying that the grandma is still with them and has possessed the child. And because the child is kind of annoying and stupid,
full of secret stuff,
it doesn't really feel like anything of value has been lost. As for the whole human nature thing, your guess is as good as mine. But for the most part, I can't really see anyone making the argument that there's any kind of commentary to be made here, other than the frightening message of, don't let your kids babysit your grandparents, or the grandparent might turn into Satan and become one with your child's flesh. Honestly, I'm not even saying that this is necessarily a bad concept, but I am saying that it doesn't belong in the Twilight Zone. Tales from the Crypt? Maybe, but definitely not the Twilight Zone. There's a whole slew of bad episodes from the 2002 series I could go over, but most of them at least seem like they're trying to have a commentary and follow the recipe. The 2002 series just fails in atmosphere because it allows itself to submit to the kind of wacky, over-the-top entertainment style you'd often see in the early 2000s. Honestly though, it's really hard to get offended at it, because at least to me, it's clear that they were trying to be the Twilight Zone, even if they weren't exactly succeeding. To return to our punching bag, I mean our example from earlier when we talked about an episode of Season 2 from the 2019 series, the world as a game scenario could have been everything I wanted from a Twilight Zone episode. At first, the atmosphere is almost there. The way this episode begins is actually pretty reminiscent of the kind of thing you'd honestly expect from the Twilight Zone, but thanks to all the other terrible things about it, it loses any of the ingredients it may have had along the way. It tries to communicate on how human nature is selfish, and how we always want what is fundamentally better than what we have, but it fails to give any sort of proper reasoning for this, and ultimately claims that being this way is just how we are, and is neither good nor bad. This is not commentary. This is just making a statement and then not choosing a stance on it. This is what we call bland and uninteresting. The episode also attempts to incorporate the unexplainable, but explains so much of it that if you aren't sick of hearing about how this works by the time the episode is halfway over, you've probably just been in and out of sleep from how boring the exposition is. And of course, to tap it all off, we have the death of a character who's mentioned by name only and has no presence in the entire episode to the main character, except when the plot calls for it. Honestly, 2019's series has nothing to say that the original series didn't already say 1,000 times better. And on top of that, it seems perfectly comfortable not trying to say anything of its own either. If it has no point, then why even sit down and watch it? I watched the entire 2019 series before making this video, and I can honestly say that the only positive thing I got out of the experience was the knowledge that I'll never have to watch it again once this video goes up. But anyway, I've gotten off the topic. Normally, this wouldn't be an issue, because an adaptation is allowed to be as similar or as different as it wants to be. But when you make such an effort to maintain the core of the franchise with your marketing and host-based setup, you can't just ignore the formula that makes it work. Doing so is ignorant, and more importantly, it shows a lack of respect for your source material and the importance of it. I know most of the staff on this new series are only in it for the paycheck, and they'd rather be working on something else. But if anyone on that team is listening right now, I implore you, please, at least try to care about this franchise and what it represents. It may not be important to you, but you're getting paid to make it the best it can be. Don't just give up and keep giving us this dollar store knockoff level trash if you make a season 3. My heart can't take any more disappointment from you guys. Pause. So this video is too big to fit into one episode, so at some point down the road you can look forward to part 2, where we talk about where the reboots actually went right, and we discuss how to fix the new series moving forward in great detail. I'd love to say that part 2 will be out before Halloween, but that just isn't the case, so if you want to make sure you're around when part 2 drops later this year, be sure to subscribe to the Missing Letter YouTube channel for updates on new Octo content and all sorts of other fun things too.